Yeah. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about the first policy issue, the real policy issue we'll deal with, which is externalities. So we'll start by talking about what are externalities and Peguis' principle of payments in accordance with product, defining externalities in terms of missing prices as opposed to interpersonal effects, and in particular talking about pecuniary versus real economic externalities. And then we'll talk about internalities and some philosophically difficult cases. I know that there's some people here who have already heard this lecture, so I apologize to those people. But we'll then talk about how policy should respond, Pigouvian taxation, the legal system, and damages as a way of dealing with externalities. We'll then talk about cap and trade and the trade-off between cap and trade and the Pigouvian system. And finally, we'll wrap up by talking about Stigler's Coase theorem and informational problems with it, when the private sector can and cannot solve externalities on their own, and in particular about how information, sort of building off of the last lecture, is the core of the externality problem. Okay, so let's start by asking what an externality is. So Chrissy, what do you think is the standard intuitive answer about what an externality is?
Some effect from an like just
Yep.
an effect from an action which causes a harm
Mm-hmm.
that can in no other way be like mitigated or avoided. So you can't put the onus back on somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's like an effect across people, roughly, right? It's like when I do something and it affects you, in some sense, right? So last year I gave a lecture about this. I also gave a lecture about rationality, where I tried to convince folks in the price theory course, not everyone here took that, but most people did, or many people did, that the notions of rationality people used were totally wrong. And I'm going to argue that the notion of externality that people use is also very mistaken. So does anyone want to give another definition of what an externality is from what Chrissy did? Yeah, Jim.
When the ways in which your actions affect someone are not like done through the price system, so they're
when the act is not considered by the price system. So let me start with a simple example of this. So like sort of the classic example, and then we're going to go to much harder, more complicated examples that will really push us to think about exactly what an externality means. So simplest case is smoking. So there are n individuals, and imagine every individual has a utility that depends on how much they smoke and the average level of everyone else's smoking, as well as on their income. And again, I'm assuming quasi-linearity here because that's what we do throughout this course. So the cigarettes smoked by, on average, is just the average of the cigarettes that each person is smoking. Income is the person, is the income earned by that individual person. And every individual is going to set their marginal utility from smoking a little bit more equal to 0, right? But if we want to maximize total utility or income, we have to maximize the sum of everyone's utility. And that's going to require that rather than setting my marginal utility from smoking equal to 0, I have to set my marginal utility of smoking plus the average utility that people get from a change in the average level of smoking equal to 0, right? And we can always achieve any other equilibrium optimum from redistributing income. So all we care about is efficiency, which is also taking into account the effect that my smoking has on the average level of smoking and therefore on the average person's utility. Okay, so this is Peguis' principle of payment in accordance with product. People should pay the average externality that their actions cause on other people. And that's not just economics, it's really common sense. So it says that anytime you do something that hurts people, you should have to pay for that. Anytime you do something that helps other people, you should get paid for that, right? And that's precisely what markets do. So when I buy something and I pay $10 to buy it, I'm taking that good away that could have been consumed by some other person who would also have been willing to pay $5, $10 for it, right? And so I'm paying the social opportunity cost of the thing that I'm buying, right? And externality policy is really about taking cases when markets don't exist and bringing them into existence, right? To ensure that everyone has the right incentives. Now, the key to externality policy is focusing as narrowly as possible on the thing where there's the missing price. So we don't want to just do anything that addresses the problem. We want to do the thing that's focused as carefully as possible on the actual problem that's being caused. So one example of this is, a lot of people say, oh, there was a, prices didn't fall enough. You often hear in macroeconomics. There's not enough employment or people aren't buying enough. So let's give people money and then they'll use that to buy more things. You hear we should have a tax cut or we should give out transfers. Well, that's a little bit crazy because what that's saying is we give people money and we hope that they spend it. Why don't we just give money to people if they spend money, right? So what I think makes a lot more sense if you think that people aren't spending enough or that there aren't enough jobs is giving subsidies for creating jobs or giving subsidies for buying stuff, which is basically having a negative sales tax or something like that, right? That makes a sort of cyclically varying sales tax makes a lot more sense if you want to encourage people to spend money than does just giving people money and hoping they spend it. I also thought this was similar with the banks. During the crisis, a lot of people said, let's give money to the banks because then they'll be able to lend. Well, why not give them lending subsidies rather than giving them money and hoping they lend it, right? It sort of doesn't make a lot of sense to indirectly get at the problem that you're trying to get at, right? Okay. Now, Peguis Principle is, I think, very powerful. It's a very fundamental thing in economics, but it gets problematic when there are risks. So if people are risk averse, imagine that you had to pay out of your own pocket every harm that your car caused. And then if you got into an accident, even if it wasn't really particularly your fault, you'd have to pay for the whole value of that other person's life that you ended up killing, right? Which would mean that you probably would have to be killed yourself or you'd have to make some enormously large payment, right? This is basically the idea behind eye for an eye justice, which seems crazy when there is randomness and you don't necessarily intend to do everything that you do, right? So it may give the right incentives, but it creates horrible risk, right? And this is why we have car insurance and traffic regulations, which try to make sure that we don't just make people bear the consequences of their actions, but if they're going to do something that's clearly going to cause harm, we insure them against some of the risk, but we stop them from doing things that wouldn't make sense for them to do unless they were trying to cause harm. And we'll return to themes like this when we talk about redistribution. Another problem that's similar to this is that you may not have enough money to pay for all the harms you cause, right? And this is certainly the case when you kill someone with your car, and that makes it really impossible to apply the principle of payments in accordance with product. So we're going to need some other means to stop misbehavior, either by intervening at a stage where you're not judgment-proof yet, even if that causes some distortion because we're not targeting exactly the harm that you're causing as closely, or we're going to have to do something that's less efficient than just charging you money, like throwing you in jail, but that's going to cost us, and then we're only going to want to do that in cases where we're really managing to deter behavior well in that way, and we'll see that when we talk about intellectual property. So these basic issues that are motivated out of solving externality problems are going to be things that are going to come up when we talk about all sorts of things later in the course. Okay. Now, imagine that I discover a giant hoard of gold. And that causes gold prices to fall. And that makes other people who own gold worse off. Is Joseph Bybee here? No? Does anyone else want to say whether they think that's an externality or not?
I guess from the conventional definition, technically it is. But
Yeah.
Like,
But what's wrong with the conventional definition?
I guess the issue is that here gold, like essentially, like other people are worse off, but they're worse off because of an increase in supply, and so they relatively have less of a share, and gold prices fall, and
Anyone else want to go? Neil?
Well, the second definition we had said that it had to be not using the price system, and here
Yeah.
it's using the price system.
Well, that's right. But so can anyone else sort of talk about intuitively why this doesn't seem like a right way? Yeah, go ahead,
So
James.
it seems to me that this is. I always think about this in general equilibrium. Why
Yeah.
the effect of my actions making other people worse off is not an externality.
Yeah.
It's because it's making somebody else better off. and
Exactly.
compensating them.
So who's the person who's made better off by the reduction in gold prices?
You, if you discovered the order.
No. That's not right, because that's me. If the money goes to me, that can't be considered something that offsets my negative externality on someone else.
Sorry, I misheard the question. Maybe.
No.
Yeah, those that are interested in buying gold.
Exactly.
Yes.
So the thing is that it makes the people who own gold worse off, but it makes the buyers of gold better off. So anytime you change your price, it's going to have offsetting effects on the people who buy it and the people who sell it, right? And that's why things that are mediated through the price system don't create any net loss to society, right? So unlike a real or a technical externality, there's no inefficiency here. So we should not internalize these sorts of pecuniary externalities. And in fact, many of the most common misapplications of the theories of externalities is because they're all just pecuniary externalities. Yeah, go ahead, James.
So if it so happened that it didn't make anybody, if you were involved in a market transaction which made everybody else in the market worse off, say you found a large hoard of gold, except for you, then given that it was all happening through the price system, it would still
That's
be
not possible. If it's happening through the price system, it can never
make everybody except
exactly.
you worse off. Oh, okay.
That's that's sort of what it means for it to happen through the price system. And in fact, we'll talk about some things that don't sound like they're through the price system, but which are effectively through the price system, and therefore they're offsetting effects. The basic thing is that prices are sort of a Lagrange multiplier that's being used in the head of society to solve an optimization problem. They're not real things about the allocation of resources. And therefore, in some sense, they're just fictions. And so they're always going to have to make someone better off and someone else worse off. Otherwise, it's not really a price. Let me try to go through some examples of this. So a lot of people will say, oh, there's an externality when a firm comes in and that causes other firms' prices to go down because they're hurting the other firms. But that's not an externality because it benefits the consumers as much as it hurts the firms. On the other hand, Dan, what do you think about if a firm comes in and doesn't lower the other firm's prices but does reduce their sales? Is that an externality? So now imagine that a firm comes in to compete and it doesn't manage to bring down the prices of any of the competing firms. Maybe even their prices go up, but it takes away some of their sales. Then would it be creating an externality?
No, because then you're just sort of like spreading the market out over more people, so there's no